Ahora es un gran honor para mí estar hoy aquí con ustedes en esta universidad histórica que tiene tanta tradición en la enseñanza del derecho. Y sobre todo estar aquí en el Instituto de Éticas Aplicadas y la Escuela de Gobierno. Muchas gracias por la invitación. Hoy hablaré de semiótica jurídica y semioética para interpretar el derecho internacional, un estudio de caso sobre la condición de la niña. Creo que el tema que trataré hoy, semiótica, semioética y derecho internacional, será de interés para sus campos de investigación. Me gustaría disculparme de antemano si cometo algún error en español, pero mis lenguas maternas son el francés y el portugués, porque mi madre es franco-canadiense y mi padre es brasileño. Aunque estudié español, pero viví en Italia varios años y cuando quiero hablar español tengo a responder en italiano debido al fenómeno del aplanamiento lingüístico. Y es quizás debido a este entorno multilingüe por lo que me interesé por la ciencia de la semiótica, de la que hablaré hoy con ustedes. Así pues, hoy, durante el turno de preguntas, si no les importa, responderé a las preguntas en inglés en lugar de en español. Pero son bienvenidos a hacer preguntas en español, pero por favor no hablen demasiado rápido. El esquema de mi presentación es el siguiente. Hoy hablaré, en primer lugar, de la semiótica jurídica, luego de semioética jurídica y, por último, ilustraré estos conceptos refiriéndome a la condición de la niña en el derecho internacional como estudio de caso. Em, ¿Qué es la semiótica jurídica? La definición es la ciencia de la semiótica examina los signos y símbolos en todas las formas de expresión. Por ejemplo, lenguaje, música y arte. La semiótica es especialmente relevante en el ámbito jurídico, ya que está repleto de símbolos que sustentan los cimientos de la sociedad. En mi capítulo titulado Semiotics in Law and Jurisprudence, en la Bloomsbury Anthology on Semiotics, editada por el profesor Jamin Pelkey, el libro de referencia sobre la semiótica, proporciono una definición de semiótica jurídica como un sistema que comprende tres elementos. Perdón. Primero, estudia el ámbito jurídico como sistema de signos infinito. Segundo, ofrece varios métodos para llevar a cabo esta ambiciosa empresa. Tercero, proporciona un lenguaje común para académicos, profesionales y el público en general. Sabemos que el derecho es un lenguaje en sí mismo que históricamente solo ha sido accesible a unos pocos privilegiados. Y recomiendo esta antología a cualquier persona interesada en aprender más sobre la semiótica en general, ya que contiene un capítulo para cada campo, como la semiótica jurídica que yo escribí, pero también la semiótica de la arquitectura o la biosemiótica. Ahora, lenguaje común. Para los semiólogos, explorar el significado del derecho constituye un ejercicio de traducción, ya que el público en general no conoce fácilmente los términos y conceptos jurídicos que requieren una interpretación en términos simples. Por tanto, la semiótica jurídica permite examinar la relación triádica entre, primero, la autoridad o los significantes maestros. La expresión en inglés es master signifiers. Segundo, el lenguaje jurídico. Y tercero, el público en general. De hecho, los significantes maestros o master signifiers, en particular abogados, académicos y responsables políticos, es decir, personas influyentes en una sociedad determinada, desempeñan un papel fundamental en la construcción y interpretación del lenguaje jurídico y sus múltiples significados. Existen dos tipos centrales de semiótica jurídica. Primero, la semiótica jurídica textual. Por ejemplo, cada cláusula de un contrato debe ser cuidadosamente negociada antes de firmarlo. La compra de una casa, un préstamo en el banco. Muchos usuarios no son lo suficientemente cuidadosos y firman sin comprobarlo. Y segundo, la semiótica jurídica visual. Por ejemplo, durante un proceso penal, el comportamiento del acusado, incluso su forma de vestir, puede influir en el jurado, en el sistema de common law, por ejemplo, y en el público en general. Ahora hablaré de semiótica jurídica y derecho internacional. Los tratados internacionales de derechos humanos deben ser claros, concisos y accesibles para todos los seres humanos del mundo, independientemente de su origen socioeconómica. Sin embargo, la terminología empleada puede ser a veces compleja y confusa, especialmente cuando se trata del trabajo de los órganos de tratados. Por ejemplo, las observaciones generales o las observaciones finales, por ejemplo, finales, concluding observations en inglés, una persona normal no supondría que constituyen las respuestas del comité al informe del Estado. E nella semiotica jurídica e derecho internacional, en derecho internacional, los redactores de los tratados pasan décadas negociando cada término empleado para formular los derechos y las correspondientes obligaciones de los estados partes. ¿Por qué? Porque saben que la terminología determinará el significado de los derechos y sus propias responsabilidades. Por ejemplo, el tiempo de redacción. El tiempo de redacción de la Convención de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos del Niño duró 10 años. Y el tiempo de redacción del Pacto Internacional de Derechos Civiles y Políticos duró 20 años. Tomo como punto de partida para el Pacto Internacional la Conferencia sobre la Organización Internacional del 1945, que sentó las bases para la Declaración Universal de los Derechos Humanos y los pactos internacionales sobre derechos civiles y políticos y derechos económicos, sociales y culturales. Pero existe una brecha significativa entre, por un lado, los significantes maestros, los master signifiers, en el derecho internacional, es decir, aquellos que participan en la redacción de los tratados de derechos humanos, en particular, representantes gubernamentales, expertos jurídicos y funcionarios de la ONU. Y, por otro lado, el objeto de los tratados, es decir, los individuos expuestos a violaciones. Como examinaré más adelante, dado que la niña ocupa una posición subordinada en la sociedad debido a su sexo y su edad, no solo está ausente del proceso de redacción, sino que a menudo desconoce el contenido de los tratados. La terminología jurídica y el modus operandi de los órganos creados en virtud de tratados. En muchos casos, desconoce por completo el marco jurídico internacional. En consecuencia, las niñas son objetos pasivos del propio discurso maestro del derecho internacional que debería promover y proteger sus derechos. Ahora me gustaría hablar de Victoria Lady Welby, precursora de la semiótica moderna, impresionante corpus en el campo de la semiótica que influyó en el trabajo de sus colegas semióticos. Victoria Welby era la ahijada de la reina Victoria y, a pesar de su condición subordinada de mujer en aquella época, pudo publicar numerosos artículos en periódicos y revistas científicas, así como libros en los campos de la filosofía, la ciencia, las matemáticas, la antropología, la educación y las cuestiones sociales. Además de compartir sus teorías a través de una red epistolar de más de 450 personalidades destacadas de su época. Lady Welby creó la teoría del significado, Significs Theory en inglés. La teoría del significado es una propuesta científica y pedagógica basada en la importancia de comprender el significado exacto de los términos y conceptos y su influencia en el pensamiento y la vida. Pretende responder a las siguientes preguntas. ¿Qué significa esto? What does this signify? ¿Cuál es el significado de? What is the meaning of? Victoria Lady Welby ideó la tríada del significado para interpretar el sentido de todas las formas de expresión. La tríada del significado, a saber, el sentido, el significado intención y el significado último. Adopto este método y lo aplico en derecho internacional para interpretar el sentido de las disposiciones de los tratados. Lo adapto al derecho internacional de la siguiente manera. En primer lugar, el sentido, the sense en inglés, es decir, el significado textual de las disposiciones de los tratados. En segundo lugar, el significado intención, meaning intention en inglés, de los redactores de los tratados cuando seleccionan terminología específica. Y, en tercer lugar, el significado último, significance en inglés, de la formulación de los derechos, utilizando la situación de las niñas como estudio de caso. Ahora, estoy estudiando la intención del significado, refiriéndome a los travaux préparatoires, trabajos preparatorios en español, como la Convención sobre los Derechos del Niño. Los trabajos preparatorios o travaux préparatoires comprenden las discusiones formales que tuvieron lugar entre los redactores del tratado. Lo estoy estudiando para entender por qué se protegieron mejor determinados derechos, por qué se seleccionaron ciertos términos en las disposiciones de los tratados para formular derechos, y si simplemente se ignoraron algunas cuestiones. Ahora, La doctrina de la semioética, una combinación de semiótica y ética. Fue ideada por los profesores Augusto Ponzio y Susan Petrelli de la Universidad de Bari, en Italia. Y esta teoría pretende identificar signos problemáticos en el orden de comunicación. Inicialmente acuñada por Ponzio, profesor Ponzio, como etosemiótica, para referirse al concepto aristotélico de ethos, apelación ética. Fue finalmente identificado como semioética y teleo, semioética del término teleo, que significa fin, y finalmente identificada como semioética para subrayar la interconexión entre semiótica y ética. Amplia la antigua semiótica de la sintomatología del corpus hipocrático, que estudiaba los síntomas físicos y mentales de los pacientes de forma triádica, en términos de anamnesis, diagnóstico y prognóstico. La semioética para examinar los síntomas actuales del mundo globalizado en todos los ámbitos del comportamiento humano, con el fin de descubrir sus causas, ofrecer un diagnóstico y identificar posibles remedios. Mientras que la mayoría de los semiólogos examinan los signos problemáticos, la teoría de la semioética va un paso más allá. Pretende encontrar soluciones a los signos problemáticos modificándolos o sustituyéndolos por otros signos. La semioética subraya la responsabilidad ética de los semiólogos, de los juristas y de todas las personas que se encuentran hoy ante el público, de analizar los signos y su significado. La semioética considera que los signos deben evaluarse no solo con el fin de ofrecer un diagnóstico, sino también para identificar posibles vías para abordar los problemas de la sociedad y humanizar el orden de la comunicación. La semioética cuestiona el mundo humano actual, partiendo del supuesto de que no es el único mundo posible, de que este mundo no ha sido establecido definitivamente, de una vez por todas, por alguna ideología conservadora. Ahora, examinemos el estudio de caso sobre la niña y el derecho internacional. En primer lugar, la tríada del significado pretende identificar los signos problemáticos en el ámbito jurídico. En segundo lugar, la semioética jurídica pretende aportar medidas concretas para resolver esos problemas. Por ejemplo, sustituyéndolos por nuevos signos, es decir, por una nueva terminología que proteja mejor los derechos de las niñas a escala internacional. Realizo este estudio sobre la situación de la niña aplicando la semiótica jurídica, la tríada del significado y la semioética jurídica en mi libro The Status of the Girl Child Under International Law, a Semioethic Analysis, recientemente publicado por Cambridge University Press. Ahora la definición de la niña. Puesto que estamos hablando de semiótica y del significado de los términos, me gustaría empezar dando una definición de la niña. Es decir, una niña, lo que implica tanto los rasgos biológicos que son exclusivos de las niñas y que repercuten en sus derechos, como la construcción social de las nociones de feminidad e infancia en la sociedad. Y según el derecho internacional, una niña es menor de 18 años. Proporciono un glosario de significados al principio de mi libro con definiciones de términos clave. En particular, las violaciones de derechos que sufren las niñas, desde el matrimonio infantil hasta los códigos sociales y de vestimenta sexualizados. Y explico la intención de significado que hay detrás de mi selección de ciertas expresiones sobre otras. Y discuto las opiniones encontradas de los estudiosos sobre la validez de esas expresiones. Por ejemplo, matrimonio infantil versus matrimonio precoz. Child marriage versus early marriage. También empleo la semiótica para examinar críticamente la definición de niña en el derecho internacional y en la lengua inglesa, es decir, en diccionarios como el Oxford English Dictionary y el Webster. En primer lugar, el sentido. Examinar el contenido de las disposiciones de los tratados, por ejemplo, la Convención sobre los Derechos del Niño. ¿Cómo se formulan las disposiciones? Obviamente, en mi libro examino varias disposiciones de tratados internacionales pertinentes para las niñas, como la Convención sobre la Eliminación de todas las formas de discriminación contra la mujer y los pactos internacionales. Pero, ahora, la Convención de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos del Niño. Por ejemplo, la Convención es neutra en cuanto al género y no menciona a las niñas en ninguna de sus disposiciones. La Convención tampoco, la Convención de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos del Niño, tampoco menciona ninguna violación que experimenten de forma exclusiva las niñas, como, por ejemplo, el feminicidio, el infanticidio femenino, el matrimonio infantil, crímenes de honor y asesinatos por dote, la mutilación genital femenino, y la sobresexualización de las niñas en los medios de comunicación convencionales y sociales como TikTok e Instagram. En segundo lugar, el significado intención, meaning intention en inglés, de los redactores de los tratados. Los trabajos preparatorios demuestran que muchos redactores no tuvieron en cuenta la situación de las niñas. Algunos redactores quisieron subrayar violaciones específicas, pero otros se opusieron firmemente a ello. En tercer lugar, el significado último, significance en inglés. El significado simbólico y jurídico del silencio sobre la niña en la convención y las cuestiones que le son propias. El silencio constituye un poderoso signo semiótico. Welby en inglés, citazione, silence often is not less significant than words themselves. For whether positive or negative, excessive or deficient, present or absent even, our words are of moment always. El silencio constituye un poderoso signo semiótico y las palabras presentes en un tratado son a menudo tan importantes como las ausentes del mismo. Entonces, para las niñas, este silencio sobre las violaciones que sufren permite a los estados, parte, desatender su deber de diligencia debida para prevenir, investigar, perseguir y castigar estos delitos. En mi investigación, recomiendo especialmente enmendar las disposiciones de la Convención sobre los Derechos del Niño para hacer referencia específica a las niñas en la definición de niño y referirse a las violaciones específicas de las niñas. Evidentemente, modificar un tratado lleva tiempo, aunque el artículo 50 de la Convención sobre los Derechos del Niño lo permite. Y también, aunque recomiendo, según un enfoque de semiótica jurídica, modificar la formulación de las disposiciones de la Convención, reconozco que esta medida por sí sola no bastará para resolver la cuestión de la violación de los derechos de las niñas a escala internacional. Sin embargo, sostengo que es un paso necesario que tendrá un impacto tanto jurídico como simbólico en el reconocimiento de la niña como titular de derechos a escala internacional. Muchas gracias por su atención.
Muchísimas gracias, Clara, por tu presentación. Abrimos para preguntas, comentarios. Está súper. Tenemos a Mauricio primero. Mauricio, por favor. Está muteado, Mauricio.
Hola Clara, ¿me escuchas bien? Un gusto, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Te tengo dos preguntas. Eh, la primera es si me puedes profundizar un poco, ¿cuál crees tú es la contribución distintiva de la semiótica, de la semiología y la semioética en relación a las teorías clásicas de interpretación del derecho? Porque mucho de lo que tú dijiste es lo que tradicionalmente en derecho hemos discutido en una versión, yo diría, obviamente no formalista, ¿cierto? El problema de muchas teorías de la interpretación ha sido el formalismo, pero yo diría las teorías más aceptadas hoy día probablemente distinguen estas mismas capas que tú has distinguido. Entonces, no me queda claro por qué el marco de la semiología o semiótica, o qué es lo que aporta, dónde ves tú una contribución de diferencia. Y la segunda pregunta tiene que ver con tu propuesta en el sentido de modificar el tratado, la Convención de Derechos del Niño. Y la pregunta es si tal vez es tan necesario en algún sentido. ¿Por qué de los presos? Porque probablemente la Convención ya está desfasada en muchos otros sentidos y ya ha sido reinterpretada por el Comité de Derechos del Niño. Yo no sigo todas las observaciones generales del Comité de Derechos del Niño, pero estoy casi seguro que ellos sí se hacen cargo de la nomenclatura niña, probablemente hoy día, y por tanto se instaló como el estándar internacional. O lo mismo que hacerse cargo de violaciones específicas, ¿cierto? Que sufren las niñas, incluso probablemente con surgimiento de tratados más específicos que se han hecho cargo de la situación de mujeres y de niñas, que antes no existían. Entonces, tal vez la pregunta es, nuevamente, por las mismas dificultades que tú dices, tiene cambiar un tratado internacional, ¿cuánto lo necesitamos a la luz de que tal vez ya evolucionó el significado y concepto en el estatus actual? Porque claro, como tú dijiste, esto se discutió en el 89, probablemente la conciencia que teníamos, o el 79, es muy distinta a la hora, y pareciera que ya el derecho internacional, a través de estos otros mecanismos, corrigió eso. Entonces, ahí me gustaría ver también si puedes detenerte un poco en eso para justificar tu propuesta. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias. Should I answer everything at once or one by one? One person at a time?
Whatever you prefer, Clara.
I maybe this one first, if you like, the two. Perfect.
Perfect.
Well, the first question is extremely important. What is the contribution of semiotics with regards, if you compare it to the many theories in interpretation, for example? And if you look at the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, Articles 31, 32, 33, and so on how a treaty should be interpreted. And this is a huge debate with semioticians and non-semioticians because many persons who are not familiar with the theory of semiotics tend to confuse it with linguistics. And they'll say, oh, it's the same as just looking at the words in a sentence, putting them together, or looking at the origin of the word, for example. Whereas semiotics is a different way of thinking. It's really looking at the signs and their connections. And I mentioned before the threefold definition of semiotics. One is looking at it that it's really the legal semiotics is really looking at the legal sphere as being filled with signs and symbols that impact society, whether we realize it or not. But also, semiotics provides methods that I consider very useful to interpret international law, but it could also be any legal document, even a simple contract of buying a home, for example. And what's really interesting, I mentioned Victoria Welby, but there's also, of course, you may be familiar with him if you're in semiotics, Charles Peirce. And his main contribution to semiotics and interpretation in general is that he acknowledged that two persons will never interpret the same sign the same way. In other words, he had the theory of the dynamic interpretant, the final interpretant, and an example of this is in international law. Just briefly, I'll give you an example. If you look at an international human rights treaty, we live on a planet with so many different cultures, so many different socioeconomic systems, that even within the same home, we could have disagreements on interpreting the same document, but internationally, it's just multiplied. And what Peirce was arguing, and this is why I find these methods in semiotics very useful, is that there's the dynamic interpretant in a specific situation of a document, but there's also the final interpretant, the sign at its extremes forms of interpretation. And I'll give you a very simple example. We think of the best interest of the child principle, which is enshrined in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And this ties into your next question, in fact, because the Convention on the Rights of the Child really put forward this essential principle of interpretation of all decisions concerning children. And I'm sure that all of us here, if we have a conversation, we can all say, of course, we all agree on the best interest of the child. Now, if we dig a little deeper and we ask ourselves specific situations and what is best for children, then I think everyone here could have a different opinion. For example, is it better to send a child to a private school, a public school, to a same-sex school, to homeschool the child, for example? Is it better for a child to stay with a parent who has more money, the parent who is more devoted, the parent who's more strict? Is it better for a child to take powerful medication for ADHD or not? Is it better for a child to spend a lot of time in front of the screen? How many hours should a child spend in front of a screen? And then we realize that we can have very different perceptions on what is best for a child. So what's interesting with semiotics and the semioticians is that they make us think every time we see a sign, every time we see a treaty or a legal document, to understand that our interpretation might not be that of other people. And this is why terminology is so important. And that's why it's so important to have as clear as possible provisions to ensure that there's as little as possible many interpretations of the same concept. And this is why, and the best interest of the child is so problematic that the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 2014 had to adopt a general comment clarifying its content. No, I think it's 2013, 2014, to clarify its comment. And the committee itself on the rights of the child explained that countries in their state reports had different interpretations of the concept itself. And that sometimes some countries were using their interpretation to strengthen their own powers through family courts, through government, and imposing their own viewpoints. So the committee itself recognized that the concept of the best interest of the child can be very subjective. And this is a huge debate worldwide. Is it better, for example, and I'll go to the final interpretant of Peirce, right? There's the immediate interpretant first, the dynamic interpretant in a given situation, but there's the final interpretant at the extreme terms of interpretation of a treaty or a word. So if we go to the extreme, think of a parent who is using their children as young influencers on social media, on TikTok, on Instagram. We have a huge global issue now of parents who are using their children to make money, right? The fame, money through YouTube videos, Instagram accounts, and so on. The phenomenon of sharenting or family influencers. Now, you could argue, well, this is positive for their child. The parents will make money out of this. They can maybe pay for university fees. They can maybe give them a better livelihood. Or that's the argument these persons would have. Others would say, no, the child is being exploited. Even their birth is, the day they're born is exploited, and their whole childhood is exploited. So the final interpretant can be very extreme. Also, the final interpretant in societies in which girls are normally or often married very young, the final interpretant could argue that it's perfectly normal for a girl child to get married early because then she will be socioeconomically protected by her husband and family-in-law. She will be a member of society and so on. So these are two very short examples to show that certain concepts can be interpreted differently worldwide. And the fact that these specific issues, such as child marriage, are not mentioned in the Convention on the Rights of the Child can enable certain countries to argue, and they do that in their state reports, that no, they're doing this for the best interest of the girls and so on. So that's an issue. But to go back to what you mentioned also, so advantage of semiotics, first, of course, looking at the world interpretation, The second methods, I talked about Pierce, and previously in my presentation, I talked about Welby. What really helped me in my work, to be honest, with Welby, is that I was used in law, and I studied at McGill University, which really focuses on the history and philosophy, McGill University in Canada. But with the aspect of Welby, the second element, which is meaning intention, we have to look at why a treaty is written a certain way. Who wrote it and why? And it gets us to question things that we may take for granted. And when I went through all these travaux préparatoires of these treaties, it was very interesting to see that some countries were really pushing for child marriage not to be mentioned, or for many violations not to be mentioned, such as female genital mutilation. So there was an intention. Some countries were really pushing to protect the child just until 14 years old. So it's not as if people were naive and going into this. It's very well thought out, and the government representatives will spend a lot of time deciding how they will go about it. So I would say the main advantage of semiotics, it makes us realize the power of words and symbols in society. And it's a curse and a blessing at the same time, because we realize the power of how we can be easily manipulated, but how we can also manipulate others very easily by the way we phrase things. As professors, we have a huge impact on how we present arguments to students. The media, of course, social media, extreme power on how the words are used. And it's not a coincidence that there are many famous semioticians who worked for the Secret Service, in many, such as the CIA, because they were looking at how to use campaigns and how to manipulate populations. And one of the great strengths in terms of semiotics is also they found out that if you repeat the same thing often enough, people will believe it. And short words that have emotions, that are connected to emotions, people will fall more for it. And we've seen this in the last years, right? So this is very interesting. Now, I'll be very quickly, I'm sorry, I'm going fast. I'm spending a lot of time to answer this, but your second question is very important. Should we change the convention? Should we modify certain provisions? Because you are right. The convention has existed since 1989, and it entered into force in 1990. In addition to that, the Committee on the Rights of the Child has been working with general comments since the beginning. And all countries in the world have ratified the convention, except for the United States of America. So even South Sudan and Somalia recently ratified it. So it's been accepted worldwide. That's why a lot of legal scholars recommend instead to have a general comment devised by the Committee on the Rights of the Child, specifically on the girl child. Or, even better, a joint general comment with the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the CEDAW Committee, the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. That will be a joint committee with expertise of both women's rights and children's rights together to clarify the responsibilities of states as guidelines. And it's interesting to mention this because the Committee on the Rights of the Child in 1994 had a general comment on the girl child. So they were concerned about her in 1994. And not a general comment, sorry, they had a day of the general discussion on the girl child. However, they failed to thereafter adopt a general comment. And this is unique because the majority of days of general discussion, think of, for example, the right of the child to be heard, child participation, think of children and the media. They were all these days of the general discussion followed by a general comment. But not the girl child. Why? Why was nothing produced? So that's an interesting semiotic sign. Another interesting semiotic sign is that the two committees, the Committee on the Rights of the Child and the CEDAW Committee for Women's Rights, they already adopted a joint general comment, general recommendation in 2014. But, surprise, it was not about girls. It was about harmful practices, which is very important, don't get me wrong. But it's interesting that they chose not to address the girl child in that context. So many people are saying this would be a first step, and this is very easy to do compared to amending a treaty. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child has already been amended, just for your information, but really just to modify the number of committee members, really procedural things, so not really content. But I argue that it would be very helpful to amend small portions, such as the definition of the child, to add girls, to add violations, because even though the Committee on the Rights of the Child does talk about girls and has been promoting their rights and many issues, only experts in international law know these general comments exist in the first place. These general comments are not legally binding. So if I'm a state representative and I see the treaty, I have to write the report, I will focus on what's in the treaty. I'm not obliged to go through all the general comments and to apply them. They're not legally binding. And a normal person who would have access, who's not a legal expert, who would have access to the convention, would not know about all these general comments. So they would take the wording, the provisions, and they would read them possibly as the final interpreted, to think, oh, it's great. Child marriage is great. It's the best interest of the girl child to be part of the community and well married and so on. So the problem, I argue, is that this ambiguity and this silence in the Convention on the Rights of the Child has an impact for states parties concretely, because they're not obliged to really address this in their reports and to spend money and resources on it, but also because any person would not be informed of the situation, would not know exactly what the criteria are. But it goes deeper even, because the girl child, and I didn't mention this in my presentation, but the definition of the end of girlhood is very vague in international law. And as a result, girlhood ends at different ages in different countries. Some countries put 18 years for the end of girlhood, others 16, others 15, others, they even use puberty or marriage, right? Why? Because the convention doesn't clarify the boundary. So this is another recommendation I make in my book to clarify this boundary. And the consequence of this is that many United Nations reports will merge the categories of women and girls in their research, UNDP, and so on, and they'll put 14-year-old girls with 45-year-old women in the same category. So we miss a lot of data on girls that are between, let's say, 14 and 18, adolescent girls. And this is important. Think of things like reproductive rights, protection against sexual violence, right to education. So we are missing internationally a lot of data on what is happening with adolescent girls. So, of course, my recommendation is just an ideal situation, because I argue that if this were proposed, and if any state could present it, it would be any state would be allowed to present this recommendation such as this one. And then the amendment would be binding for all the states who thereafter ratify the amendment. But then it would inform the future state reports. And hopefully, if this were accompanied by some media support, then individuals would be aware of the responsibility of states to really address issues pertaining to girls. Because I didn't provide statistics to the audience today, but there are huge violations of girls' rights worldwide. Female infanticide and so on, sexual violence, sexual exploitation, sex trafficking, and so on. And also new issues with OnlyFans and Pornhub. So this would be very interesting to clarify the responsibility of states. So we'll see, but it would take a bit of time, and it's a bit idealistic. So I agree with you, it wouldn't be easy to do. But I do think these concepts need to be clarified, because the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as it is, I believe, is not sufficiently protecting girls. Thank you.
Ana, y después Loreto.
Ya, gracias, Clara. Yo estaba pensando, cuando tú estabas mencionando la definición de niña, me hizo pensar en la definición de mujer, que hoy día es un poco contestable. Entonces, una curiosidad de cuál sería tu respuesta a ciertas perspectivas feministas incluso. Creo que muchas feministas estarían muy a favor de definir la niña, definir la mujer de la manera como defines tú, pero alguna corriente feministas quizás les sonaría raro esa definición tan tradicional de niñas. ¿Cómo responderías tú a esa crítica?
Well, thank you so much for asking this question, because in my book, it's interesting. As I was writing the book, the definition of woman was modified in the Cambridge English Dictionary to include anyone who, quote, self-identifies as a woman. So that was the new definition. So I had to decide how to go about my book in that regard. And I realized that given that I was focusing on violations that are specific to girls, many violations, if not most, are based on girls' biological realities. I'll give you an example. Female infanticide. The parents will not ask the two-day-old girl, how do you self-identify? They will say, oh, biological body, it's a girl, let's kill her, right? The parents who eliminate girls, and just to point out, there are 134 women and girls missing worldwide as a result of prenatal sex selection and female infanticide. So I'm not exaggerating, and it's in many countries, more than we think, actually. So parents who decide to eliminate the fetus, the female fetus, will not think, oh, will this female fetus one day self-identify as a man? They'll just say, oh, XX, eliminate, right? So the issue also of girls who can, if they're sexually assaulted, can become pregnant during war and conflict, female genital mutilation, the issue also of over-sexualization, which is happening with boys too, but girls are really targeted. So I decided, I made the academic decision to focus on a double definition, which is both biological traits that are directly linked to violations and also acknowledge the important social construct in society, how women are viewed, how children are viewed. And I don't only look at the discrimination experienced by women in society and girls, so sexism, but also examine childism, which is a discrimination that is child-specific. And to give you a definition, if you're not familiar, it's when adults view children as their own possessions, and they use them for their own desires and ambitions. Think of very ambitious parents who force their children to study in very competitive programs. I'm exaggerating, but I mean, think of parents, stage mothers in Hollywood, who will exploit their children, or on television. I'm thinking of Globo in Brazil, very popular. So when you have young children in all those telenovelas, did they really make the decision to work at, in Hollywood, you can work at 2 days old. Can you really make an informed consent at 2 days old? So in my book, I look at both sexism and childism, and I explain in my glossary of definitions why I focus on this, and I acknowledge that it's really interesting and pertinent to look at the issue of trans rights and persons who self-identify as a different gender or who are non-binary. But this is so complex that I believe it should be examined in separate studies, which is really the case. In the West, it's very well examined. And another thing is my book is very international, and this movement has been mostly associated with the West, or the global North, if you want, not so much in the global South. So my goal was to really look at what we have, violations that are concretely happening to girls. But thank you for the question, because it's something I had absolutely, and in my book, not only do I clarify why I do this in my meaning glossary, but I also explain it in my definition of what is a girl, femalehood, womanhood, and I provide all the definitions to clarify. And I even recommend readings in that field for the readers who might be interested in learning more about that, but in specific publications. I couldn't cover all this. It was a limited number of pages for my book.
¿Lore?
Gracias, Diego. Muchas gracias, Clara. Esto está completamente fuera de mi expertise, pero mi preocupación va por la línea de como la universalidad del ser humano. Porque a la hora que tenemos que distinguir el niño de la niña, uno bien podría pensar que eso, o sea, que uno podría hacer un caso similar para introducir, no sé, personas de distintas razas, de distinto tipo de sexualidad. Y en la medida que la convención como está, que no hace ningún tipo de distinción, sino que considera al niño como universalmente, como un concepto universal del que las mujeres, esperemos, pueden también participar, Existen interpretaciones bajo las cuales todas las violaciones que tú planteabas sí son, como sí están recogidas en la convención, o sea, todo el infanticidio, la violencia sexual, o sea, todo eso uno puede usar la convención para criticar eso, creo yo, de forma más que razonable. Entonces, como que ¿cuál es tu visión como de, existe algo realmente universal en el ser humano y si lo vamos a distinguir en términos de los derechos humanos de los niños y de las niñas, si no debemos también hacer otros tipos de distinciones adicionales?
Well, this is a very important question, and this is something I address in my chapter on the definition of girl and also sexism and childism. First of all, I want to be clear that my goal is not to conduct Olympics of oppression, very popular in North America, between girls and older women or girls and boys. I do acknowledge, though, in my research and my book, that there are certain violations that girls are more prone to than adult women or boys. For example, a girl who is sexually assaulted, for example, will have less means, less access to reproductive health care than an adult woman. Just an example. A girl child has less economic empowerment than an adult woman, even legally. She can't really rent an apartment, buy a house. Even though sometimes she's the head of the household and she's working full time, she usually doesn't, she's not allowed to have employment, so to speak, that an adult woman have, and thus economic independence. So I do acknowledge these differences, but I do also explain that each group may have different vulnerabilities. And an example is boys. And in fact, I would recommend to amend a little bit the Convention on the Rights of the Child to protect boys too. And I'll answer the second part of your question, but because there are certain violations that are unique to boys and that we're not addressing right now. And boy children are experiencing a lot of pressures nowadays. It's not easy to be a boy in 2025. So this is something also that will be interesting to look into. And very simple examples, boys are overrepresented, of course, in armed conflict, overrepresented in child labor. Girls are more in domestic work, which is very dangerous because you're in a home, the private sphere, you can be abused. But boys also in very dangerous work and in factories and so on. Boys also, if they're sexually assaulted, it's very difficult socially to speak out and to gain justice because of prejudices and stereotypes in society. So they have this additional burden. These are just two examples. But this is a very good question. Normally, to be honest, in 1966, we were good. We had the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the two international covenants, one covering economic rights, social and cultural rights, one covering civil and political rights. So technically, we could have stopped there because these treaties protect the human family, all human beings, all persons, individuals. So it's very neutral, generally speaking, although they use male pronouns, he and possessive, he, his, etc. But generally speaking, and there's already been a tendency internationally to look at, I would say, more specific groups to be protected. So we have the convention already for children. We didn't really need, theoretically, if everything were fine, we would just stop with a pact, the international covenants and the Universal Declaration. But we did go for the CEDAW in 1979 for women. We had to address racial discrimination specifically. We had to address also children's rights. In 2006, persons with disabilities. Again, in theory, this should not be necessary. If we didn't, normally we wouldn't need qualified universalism. But what happened is after 1966, the international community realized that these treaties, the states who reported to those committees were not looking at the situation of women, racial discrimination. They were not looking at the issue of children or persons with disabilities. So that's why specific treaties were added. But I agree with you. Normally, if we were today in 1966 and we were hopeful, I might tell you, we don't need more treaties. We should focus on countries having great reporting systems, and that should be sufficient. But we've seen in the last decades that there has been already a specialization. But I see what you mean also. The second part of your question is, okay, how far do we go? Because how many conventions can we have? Do we want one about girls with disabilities and so on? How far are we going to go? So my recommendation was not. Initially, I considered whether there should be, hypothetically, a convention on the girl child, and maybe even one on boy child. But then, of course, that would be so much, because as previously explained by Mauricio Duce, the committees are already organized. They have the reporting system. The countries are used to reporting and making progress, or not always actually progress, so to speak. But in that case, it would be a bit an additional burden. Countries, especially that don't have so many resources, would have to, and oh no, we have the report on children, next year girls, next year boys, then it would be too much. So I agree with you that maybe additional treaties, no, but amending and clarifying a few terms here and there might not be a bad idea. There's, for example, if a few violations pertaining to boys and girls were added in the CRC, it wouldn't be impossible, and it could just clarify a few things. And then you're right, maybe some persons might say, well, let's clarify other rights, maybe more rights for children with disabilities in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But just to give you an example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has a specific article protecting children with disabilities. It does not have one for girls or their violations. So the treaty drafters knew they should address specifically disabilities. Why not girls? See, so this is a bit my argument. Why is a girl always so invisible in those contexts? She's not really a woman, and within the child category, she doesn't experience the same things as boys. So she might fall through the cracks, and this is what often happens. And I can tell you, during my research, I was impressed by the silence in United Nations reports pertaining to data specifically on girls, especially on adolescent girls. So girls between, let's say, 14 to 18, there's very little data. It's very difficult to find. And another thing I'd like to point out is the focus of international law historically has mostly been the global north, in some cases, providing references and lecturing the so-called global south, which before we referred to, of course, as third world and developing, developed, and so on. But now we have a lot of violations that stem from the global north. And one of the violations I examine in my book is the over-sexualization of girls on TikTok, Instagram, also on through OnlyFans and other means. And this stems from the global north. But it has reached the so-called global south through Bollywood, Nollywood in Nigeria, K-pop, and also, obviously, lots of other countries. So it's interesting to say that, and the United Nations often will focus their studies on violations that are traditionally associated with the global south, for example, child marriage, and not so much on the violations that originated in the global north. And again, we can also criticize, by the way, and this is something I do in my book, I criticize the terms global north and global south, because nowadays the world has changed so much with BRICS, for example. Many of the BRICS countries are doing way better economically than many Western so-called European countries, for example, in terms of economy, social unrest. So it's interesting also to look at these very simplified dynamics that are not always reflective of what happens in the world. If you think of China, Brazil, countries like this, India, that it's interesting to see the situation has changed a lot in the last decades. So to conclude, yes, we have to be careful not to be too specific, but adding a few clarifications in treaties would be a lot simpler than adding new conventions.
Clara, yo te hago una pregunta corta y cerramos porque ya estamos un poco en la hora, pero también soy totalmente fuera del tema. Y de hecho, cuando partiste la presentación tuve que buscar qué era la semiótica. Entonces, te quería preguntar, que un poco parecido a lo que te preguntaba Mauricio, pero un poco desde otro enfoque, que es, en tu opinión, ¿qué aporta la semiética en comparación a las teorías legales feministas o derechamente a la teoría feminista en general al entendimiento de los derechos de las niñas? O sea, ¿qué tiene este enfoque en particular que en el fondo podría informar políticas públicas, en este caso sobre género, que las mismas teorías de género no tienen?
Well, it's very interesting, and it's true, this ties into the previous question, because already I get asked the question a lot is why semiotics? What does it add compared to older theories or linguistics? And this is semioticians always get that question. But semioethics is even newer, right? It's 20 years old only, so it's very, very recent. And what does it add? What I find interesting in terms of semioethics is that up until I discovered this theory, I had been raised to see situations, legal situations, but I'd say international law, as a static entity. This is how, for example, and this ties into Loreto Cox's question. I thought, okay, we have the Universal Declaration, we have these international covenants. This is what we have, and there it is. Why would we go further? And we shouldn't look too much into it. And with Peirce and Welby, I got to look at the intention, the meaning intention of the users. And looking at the Travaux Préparatoires, it's fascinating because the 1980s and 70s, there were many changes worldwide, as you know. And so the governments would change and there would be different political parties and they would come with completely opposite viewpoints on the rights of children. And that's interesting, parenthesis. But to go back to semioethics, what's interesting about semiotics is it really goes one step further than semiotics generally, because most semioticians historically will analyze problems and very brilliantly and look at various interpretants, or for example, the meaning triad, but then they stop there. And it's a bit a pessimistic viewpoint, if you don't mind my saying so, because then we feel like, okay, there are so many problems, but we can't really do anything about it. And what's uplifting about semioethics is the idea that it's possible to change signs in a communication order. And I give the example in international law, but that's true for anything. It's true in social media. It's true in government practices. It's the way we communicate with one another. These signs can be modified to improve better relationships between human beings, for example. Now, to tie this into feminist theories, there are so many feminist theories, and there are so many, unfortunately, tensions between groups of feminists right now. Third wave, second wave, fourth wave. The problem also, what do we mean by feminists? Who speaks on behalf of a group? And oftentimes, when I look at measures that are taken by groups, whether it's feminists or child rights activists or anything like that, and I'm giving the example of girls' rights, when there's a big issue that comes into play and that we hear all of us overnight on social media, or when there's a new NGO that becomes super prominent and we hear about them, a bit like the people who become overnight famous on TikTok. Why did they become famous? Is there an algorithm that's encouraging us, that's telling us that this person is interesting? Or is it a grassroots, organic reality that this person suddenly is known around the world in 24 hours? So what I love about semiotics and semioethics is we see that things are not rigid, but it forces us to look at what's behind it. Who's behind it? Who's behind the theory? Is this person really working in the interests of girl children, in my case? An example is if there's this NGO that's suddenly working on a specific girls' rights issue, is it something organic? Is it girls in a village who stand up together, or girls on social media who organically fight for their rights? Or is it some billionaire who's financing this NGO through various means and whose objective might not be really the best interests of girls, but something else? So I think semiotics and semioethics forces us to see that things are not always as they seem. They can be modified, but we have to be so careful with all the signs and symbols that we're bombarded with every day to really take the time to think, am I being manipulated? Am I being lied to? And what role am I playing in all this? How can I be an ethical person in taking the time to understand what's happening, to look at potential solutions, but do so wisely and not just at the flip of the hand without knowing really what is happening? And I would ask you, do you really think it's organic, the tensions we have between feminists nowadays and the groups? Or is there an idea to divide and conquer? So I'll leave you at that. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, y con esto terminamos la presentación de Clara. Clara, te agradecemos mucho tu tiempo, la amabilidad de estar con nosotros. De nuevo le agradecemos a Tana, que fue la persona que hizo el contacto y te trajo. Y bueno, estamos en contacto para lo que necesites.